I want to begin today a series of short segments. Well, Debbie goes, not that short, but short in the sense that I'm going to stretch it out over probably a week or so, maybe even longer. But I want to focus on kind of an introduction to Russian literature. Why? Because Russian literature is really among, if not the greatest literature in the world. And it's great for complex reasons, but if I had to sum it up, I would say that Russian literature has enormous psychological depth. It probes the interior, not just of the human heart and the human mind, but also of the human soul. And it's that depth, the way that the Russian writers can kind of burrow to the bottom, that gives their literature an enduring interest, and an interest to believers and sort of unbelievers, religious believers and unbelievers alike. Now, I usually take on these kinds of topics as part of an expedition, so I've got a decent exposure to Russian literature, but not a comprehensive one. And so what I do, and this is kind of what I did over the break. People ask how I spend my time. Well, one way I spend my time is I have a little more free time, not just to focus on my work. And by work, I mean preparation for the podcast, and then also the movie that we're working on for this year. It's huge. I'm going to say a lot more about it as we lead up to it, but I'm also keeping a lot of it under wraps because it's so powerful and so, well, I have to say, explosive. And that's going to come out later in the spring. So I've got book project, movie project, I've got podcast, normally I have limited time to be able to do forays into sort of general landscapes of ideas, whether philosophical or literary. But over the Christmas holiday, I listened to a series of terrific lectures on Russian literature. Some of it covering figures that I was more familiar with, like Dostoevsky, one of my favorites, and Tolstoy, but also other figures in Russian literature. Now, what I want to introduce you to is what may be called the golden and silver eras of Russian literature. Russian literature kind of came into its own in the 19th century. Prior to that, there are some notable works, but there's nothing that we would consider of sort of world class. But suddenly in the 19th century, and this is similar to Germany in the 19th century in the areas, for example, of philosophy, or ancient Greece in the 5th century BC in a number of areas, including plays and philosophy. Sort of out of nowhere comes a series of great figures, one kind of greater than the other, and they provide a kind of constellation of genius that is very hard to explain. Why then? Why there? So let me talk a little bit about some of these key figures in Russian literature. The first one is Pushkin. Pushkin, the author of a number of great poems, but also longer works. I'll talk probably about one of them. It's called Eugene Onegin, or in Russian, Evgeny Onegin. This is Pushkin. And from Pushkin, we move to the somewhat grotesque work, but also very interesting and over-the-top, very Russian, the Russian writer Gogol. Gogol is most noted for his short stories. I'm probably going to focus on one somewhat amusingly called The Nose. The Nose. Then we move to Dostoevsky, known for a number of works, notes from The Underground, The Possessed, a work called The Idiot. We'll come to what that means, The Idiot. But his two most famous works, Crime and Punishment, one of my kind of favorite novels of all time, and then a very deep spiritual and psychological novel called The Brothers Karamazov. Some people think that's Dostoevsky's kind of magnum opus, his master work. I would put Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov in kind of the same category. Then we move to Leo Tolstoy, again the author of two unquestioned masterpieces, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But Tolstoy was also a tremendous short story writer, wrote a number of other works, in some ways the grand old man of Russian literature. And he lived all the way into the early part of the 20th century, so he spans a giant space of Russian literature. There was also another figure in the Russian Golden Age who today we would rank as one notch below Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but at the time was considered their equal, if not their superior. In fact, many contemporary writers would put this man first, and then Tolstoy and Dostoevsky kind of side by side in kind of shared second place. And I'm speaking here of a man named Turgenev. The writer Turgenev, best known for a work that I want to discuss, at least briefly. It's called Fathers and Sons. And Turgenev was, I think what at the time made him seem superior to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky is he's a man of very sort of moderate or balanced sensibility. You would never call Tolstoy or Dostoevsky balanced. They have, you may say, the fanatical temperament. They dive into things. They are strongly attached to what they believe. They generally believe people who are on the other side are completely wrong and should be sort of put away or ignored. But here you have Turgenev, by the way, grew up in a rich family. His family had a whole bunch of serfs, which are virtual slaves working for the family. And Turgenev had this remarkable ability to sort of experience things from the point of view of the serf, depict, if you will, how the serf sees things. And so here you have an overlord who somehow has sufficient empathy to be able to depict and portray the serf's point of view. I'll say more about Turgenev later. And we move then from the golden era of Russian literature into what can be called the silver era. The silver era is kind of the era that comes right after the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So the greatness of Russian literature spans from about the 1830s and 40s. Here we're talking about Pushkin, on through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, but then on to the 1890s and the 1910s. So now we're talking about a new group of figures with a completely new style. You'd never think that they were really the offspring or the direct offspring of the golden era. I'm talking about Chekhov, who was both a playwright and a short story writer. Chekhov's work, The Seagull, very important in not only in literature, but also in drama, very important in the modern stage. Chekhov also wrote unforgettable short stories, but very different types of stories than you'd get from, say, Tolstoy. Then we move into the sort of Soviet era, and here things become really interesting because how do you survive as a writer? How do you even write in an era that is trying to not only control writers, but in some cases harass them, lock them up, and execute them, and make writers toe the party line? What's remarkable is that some of the greatest Soviet writers are either writing ironically against the party line, or they were originally enthusiastic about the party line, but later became disillusioned. And in one notable case, the case of a guy named Sholokhov, you have a guy who towed the party line, who actually was a devoted communist, and yet managed somehow to produce one great work, which is called And Quiet Flows the Dawn. We'll talk about that also. So in the silver era of Russian literature, it begins with Chekhov. It continues with Maxim Gorky. It continues with Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago. The poet Anna Akhmatova, I think, comes from the earlier era, but she's sometimes lumped in with this gang. And I think the greatest Russian writer, perhaps of the 20th century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I could do probably a whole series. I've been a huge fan of Solzhenitsyn, could do probably a whole series on him. I'll close with a kind of funny anecdote from the Russian golden era about the relationship between Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. Apparently, Turgenev was on good terms with Dostoevsky until he lent him money, and then Dostoevsky began to hate him. This seems kind of crazy, but it's really very Russian. Dostoevsky thought And even though Dostoevsky was in desperate straits and needed the money, he thought the fact that Turgenev, who was a rich man, was helping him out was an attempt by Turgenev to establish Turgenev's superiority over Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky, never wanting to repay kindness with kindness in this case, creates a character like Turgenev, a kind of opportunistic novelist who goes around, who has relatively limited talent, but goes around helping people financially, basically to get a higher literary standing for himself. So poor Turgenev was not well treated, even though he tried to help. And then Turgenev got into a fight with Tolstoy, and Tolstoy began to put out the word. In fact, Tolstoy challenged Turgenev to a duel. Turgenev was wise enough to refuse and skip town, but then Tolstoy began to put out the word that Turgenev was a coward. Finally, Tolstoy, years later, realized that he had acted badly, called upon Turgenev to reconcile their differences, which Turgenev, again, very charitably and very happily did. But the moment they reconciled their differences, Tolstoy challenged Turgenev to a game of checkers. Tolstoy lost and apparently cut off dealings with Turgenev after that because he couldn't stand this seems insane. You have people behaving like 5-year-olds, at least Tolstoy in this case. So you have the paradox, a very Russian paradox, of a man of unquestioned genius and greatness with deep insight into the human soul who can't forgive a man for beating him at a game of checkers. This is the fascinating landscape of Russian literature. Tomorrow I'm going to introduce the subject. I'm not even going to get into any of these writers yet. I'm going to introduce the subject by just talking about the three main rich currents of historical and moral themes that provide the varied and complex and highly interesting foundation for the golden and silver eras of Russian literature.